For all our great history, for all our empires, philosophies, and works of art, the most significant physical legacy of the last century may be a subtle, indelible signature inscribed into the very fabric of the planet. It's in the soil, it's in the oceans, it's even in the marrow of your bones. A subtle radioactive hum, a whisper of isotopes that didn't exist before 1945. It's the ghost of more than 500 open-air explosions, a collective act of atmospheric vandalism whose fallout has dusted every square inch of this world, from the highest peaks of the Himalayas to the deepest trench of the Pacific Ocean. We all, every one of us born since, have been physically touched by nuclear weapons, and yet, for all that intimate connection, they feel distant, don't they? Like a story from another time, a grandparent's tale of hiding under desks of a long, cold, ideological winter that has since thawed. The bomb, with a capital B, was once this exotic, mysterious, terrifying thing, a constant low-level thrum of anxiety that shaped geopolitics and haunted our collective dreams. But now, in the 21st century, it's almost become, well, mundane, irrelevant, something most people rarely, if ever, think about. We speak of nuking a ready meal in the microwave. It's a plot device in a spy film, a bit of casual hyperbole, a threat that has receded into the background noise of our lives. But the silence is deceptive, because they are still here, thousands of them. Resting in their silos beneath quiet fields of wheat, gliding silently through the abyssal depths of the oceans in the bellies of submarines, waiting patiently in hardened bunkers and on the wings of aircraft. They are a threat that continues to exist, an existential question mark hanging over the future of our civilization. And in some ways, the danger they pose now is more insidious, more complex, and perhaps even more likely to be realized than during the stark bipolar certainties of the Cold War. They remain as mysterious and profoundly misunderstood as they were in the desert of New Mexico in that fateful summer of 1945. Perhaps even more so now that our awareness is shaped less by palpable fear and more by the flickering phantoms of cinema and television. So I think it's important, vital even, that we try to bridge that gap between perception and reality, to understand what they are, to comprehend the story of their origin, a tale that encompasses the deepest secrets of the cosmos and the most profound frailties of human nature. Because if they are ever used again, the shockwaves will not just flatten cities, they will shake the very foundations of human society. The subject is vast, of course. It sprawls across physics and military strategy, politics, psychology, sociology, even art and culture. You can't possibly do it all justice in one sitting. But my intention here is not to be exhaustive. It is rather to give you a sense of the thing. An overview, an appreciation of the basic scientific truths, a little historical perspective, and perhaps a moment to reflect on the unique moral and philosophical dilemmas that coil around this singular human creation. Because while it may not be our fingers on the buttons, we all have a profound, inescapable stake in what happens if those buttons are ever pushed. The strange, unfortunate truth is that these weapons, far from being a relic of history, involve every single one of us, from the citizen of a declared nuclear power to a resident of the most remote island in the Pacific. Everyone born since the dawn of the nuclear age has been influenced, their world shaped by the mere presence of these devices in ways both subtle and profound. They have altered our political structures, our economies, our military thinking, the very way nations interact. They've even crept into our vocabulary, our imagery, the nightmares that trouble our sleep. Understanding them, then, isn't an academic exercise. It's a tool for navigating the world we inhabit. It's about being able to distinguish genuine danger from political rhetoric, to appreciate the true weight of a flippant remark about nuking an enemy. It's about calming our own darkest, most human fears with the clarity of understanding. So, where do we begin? Well, we have to start with the big difference. We're so accustomed to the idea of nuclear technology now, the casual familiarity can be disarming. Someone jokes that we should just nuke them, whoever them might be at the time, and we all have a basic sense of what that means. A big explosion, radiation, fallout, generally bad stuff. But what is it really? What makes a nuclear weapon so fundamentally different from other kinds of bombs? Isn't it just a matter of scale? Aren't they just bigger, noisier, perhaps a bit dirtier because of that radiation thing? And didn't we get rid of most of them ages ago, after the Cold War ended? The answer to that last question, of course, is no. As of now, there are still something like 14,000 nuclear weapons in the world, held by 9 nations. That's a dramatic reduction from the peak of 60 or 70,000 during the height of the Cold War, but it is still a staggering number. And if we've managed to dismantle so many, then surely we don't have that much to worry about, right? Unfortunately, that's also wrong. Nuclear weapons are a big deal, and that fact doesn't change even if their numbers do. The reason is that they are different. In profound, fundamental ways. They are not simply big bombs scaled up. They work on principles far different from what we now call conventional weapons, a distinction that was utterly unnecessary before 1945, and they are immeasurably more powerful and dangerous as a result. In one sense, the bigger bombs idea is correct. There's no question they are far more powerful than any other type of explosive. We even measure their power, their yield, in terms of a chemical explosive that's been around for almost 2 centuries, TNT or trinitrotoluene. It's a convenient shorthand. We talk of kilotons, thousands of tons of TNT, or megatons, millions of tons of TNT, but this is just a linguistic convenience, a way for our minds to grasp the ungraspable. The power of a nuclear weapon doesn't come from the same source as TNT. Conventional explosives, things like dynamite, nitroglycerin, they are all expressions of chemistry. They create their violent energy through rapid chemical reactions. These reactions are all about the electron bonds that allow atoms to join together into molecules. It's about the breaking of those bonds. It's a process that only involves the outer regions of the atom, those little electrons dancing around the nucleus in their different energy levels. The nucleus itself, the heart of the atom, remains untouched. When chemical bonds are torn asunder, whether in an explosion or a gentler reaction, the elements involved remain the same, even if they recombine to form new substances. Carbon is still carbon, oxygen is still oxygen. Nuclear reactions, as the name implies, are an entirely different matter. They involve the nucleus of the atom, the dense, compact core of protons and neutrons. The number of protons and neutrons determines the identity of an element. Most of the elements we encounter every day, oxygen, iron, silicon, are stable. Their nuclei are balanced, content. They contain a roughly equal number of protons and neutrons, but other heavier elements, the real behemoths of the periodic table, have large crowded nuclei. They are unstable, with an unbalanced ratio of protons to neutrons, making the nucleus a restless churning mass that continually spits out particles, trying to find some semblance of balance. These elements, like uranium, the most famous example, are radioactive, and it is this radioactivity, this inherent instability, that makes nuclear energy and nuclear explosions possible. Because these nuclei are so unstable, they will eventually decay into other, more stable elements. In nature, this is a process that can take a very, very long time. Thousands, even millions of years. But it also means it doesn't take much to push them over the edge. It's possible to dramatically speed up that process by doing something as simple as firing a single neutron at the nucleus. When that happens, in a process called fission, the nucleus splits apart. It shatters. The fragments of the former nucleus, each now a separate entity with its own number of protons and neutrons, are now new, lighter elements. And in that violent rupture, some of the original neutrons are sprayed off on their own into space. If other unstable nuclei are close enough, those stray neutrons can collide with them, tearing them apart as well. And the process continues, accelerating, releasing more and more neutrons and more energy in what's known as a chain reaction. If this all happens fast enough, on a timescale of less than a microsecond, 1/1,000,000th of a second, the result is a nuclear explosion, a release of vast amounts of heat, kinetic energy and radiation. But there's another way to get a nuclear explosion. Instead of splitting apart heavy ponderous nuclei, you can do the opposite. You can fuse together the lightest ones of all, the nuclei of the hydrogen atom, which consist of just a single proton. This process also creates new, heavier elements, and in doing so, releases a truly staggering amount of energy. This is called fusion, and it is the fundamental process that makes the stars shine, including our own sun. You can experience the power of fusion for yourself every single day. Just step outside and feel the warmth of the sun on your skin, and reflect on the fact that that energy has travelled 93 million miles to reach you. It is the energy of fusion. The problem with fusion, though, the great cosmic catch, is that it requires extremely high temperatures. We're talking millions of degrees. That's because hydrogen nuclei, protons, are all positively charged, and they naturally repel each other with immense force. You have to get them moving at incredible speeds to overcome that natural antipathy and fuse together. In the nuclear weapons business, this means that a fusion bomb, a hydrogen bomb, needs a fission bomb just to set it off. It's the only way to generate such high temperatures instantaneously here on Earth. So in a way, every hydrogen bomb is really two bombs in one. For now, the main point to grasp is that nuclear weapons are fundamentally different from other explosives, and they come in two basic varieties: fission and fusion. The first type is what was traditionally known as an atomic bomb. The latter is a hydrogen bomb, or more scientifically, a thermonuclear weapon. These terms are really just rough approximations. In general use, though, most people don't really bother to distinguish between them. Atomic bombs, hydrogen bombs, nukes, they're all pretty much the same thing in the popular imagination. But not long after Hiroshima, the special status of the atomic bomb in the public consciousness was signified by a simple typographic distinction. In countless newspaper articles, magazine pieces and editorials, it became known simply as the bomb. With a capital B, no further explanation was necessary. Everyone knew that the capital B meant the atomic bomb, not your average 500-pound bomb dropped from an aeroplane or an artillery shell. Only a nuclear weapon, whether atomic or hydrogen, merited that capital letter in that specific article. Those little literary distinctions separated the past from an uncertain and frightening future. So how did we arrive at this precipice? How did humanity, in the space of less than 50 years, go from discovering the faint glow of radioactivity in a Parisian laboratory to unleashing the power of the stars on itself? It is a story of genius, of desperation, of political intrigue, and of a series of scientific discoveries that cascaded one after the other, leading to a conclusion that few could have initially foreseen. When the atomic bomb became a reality in 1945, the world responded with a mixture of shock, fear, and wonder. Yet the idea of it wasn't a complete surprise. Yes, the extreme secrecy of the Manhattan Project meant the public had absolutely no idea that approximately $2 billion of their tax dollars had been spent on it. But the notion of some kind of superweapon related to the atom had been percolating in the culture for a while, in comic strips and pulp science fiction magazines. Soon after scientists began to investigate that mysterious phenomenon of radioactivity and to map the inner geography of the atom, imaginative writers picked up on these new discoveries and ran with them. H.G. Wells, already famous for his time machines and Martian invasions, was not only a trained scientist but also a sharp social critic, fascinated by politics and the ways humans fight amongst themselves. So it was almost natural that in 1914 he would publish a novel about global warfare using super scientific weapons. His book, The World Set Free, contains what appears to be the first use of the phrase atomic bomb. In the novel, which was directly inspired by and dedicated to the scientists who had discovered radioactivity, cities are destroyed by atomic bombs dropped from aircraft. The resulting near destruction of civilization leads to the birth of a new world government. Wells lived until 1946, long enough to witness the partial realization of his darker visions over Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But the scientists who created the real nuclear weapons weren't trying to fulfill the predictions of a British writer. They were trying to see if such a weapon was truly possible, and if so, to build it before the Nazis could use it to enslave the world. The man to whom Wells dedicated his book was Frederick Soddy, a brilliant young chemist who, working with the even more brilliant physicist Ernest Rutherford, had proved that radioactivity involved certain elements, like radium, somehow changing or transmuting into other elements. The details were still fuzzy, but it was clear that a great amount of energy was released in the process. Soddy and others proclaimed that if this energy could be controlled, the atom might provide an endless source of power for humankind, or a weapon. Rutherford went on to discover the nucleus of the atom, but what was happening inside was still not completely apparent. Then came the quantum revolution and Einstein's famous equation E=mc², showing that even a tiny amount of mass contained a vast reservoir of energy, if it could only be unlocked. The final necessary piece of the puzzle was discovered in 1932 by the physicist James Chadwick, the neutron. Here was a particle with no electric charge, a way to penetrate the positively charged barrier of the nucleus. What would happen if someone tried shooting neutrons into the nuclei of heavy elements like uranium? In 1934, the Italian physicist Enrico Fermi began a series of experiments to answer that question. When he got to uranium, the heaviest naturally occurring element, things got interesting. He observed the inexplicable production of lighter elements. Later in Berlin, the chemists Otto Hahn and Fritz Strassmann repeated the experiments. Their colleague, the physicist Lise Meitner, a brilliant mind who had been forced to flee Nazi Germany, analysed their results. And she realised the answer, so simple yet so elusive, because no one had believed it possible. The uranium nucleus had split. Hahn and Strassmann had actually split the uranium nucleus into two near equal halves, releasing an enormous amount of energy in the process. Borrowing a term from biology, the phenomenon was called fission. The news travelled fast. The Danish physicist Niels Bohr brought it to the United States, sharing it with his colleagues there, including Leo Szilard and Fermi, who now realised he had actually split the atom years before and not even known it. Although fission was immediately recognised as a monumental breakthrough, not many people were worried about atomic bombs just yet. It was a phenomenon of great scientific interest, but whether it could be harnessed for practical purposes remained an open question. Some visionary individuals, however, weren't so sanguine. One of them was Szilard, a Hungarian refugee who by 1939 was at Columbia University in New York. Szilard was the type of intellect who was generally several steps ahead of most everyone else. He had been thinking about atomic bombs for longer and more intensively than most. He was familiar not only with Wells' novel but also with Nazi tyranny, and he was deeply disturbed by the fact that fission had been discovered, of all places, in the heart of Nazi Germany. What if Adolf Hitler heard about it, realised its potential, and devoted all of Germany's renowned scientific prowess to building an atomic bomb? In the spring of 1939, Szilard conducted an experiment that confirmed his worst fears. Uranium did indeed appear to produce enough extra neutrons to sustain a chain reaction. He recalled later that at the time, there was very little doubt in my mind that the world was headed for grief. Confirmation of a chain reaction also confirmed the possibility of a bomb, at least theoretically. The practical details were still a mystery, but the mere possibility was enough for Szilard. He decided that the United States government wasn't taking the matter seriously enough. He realised his own fame and influence were limited, so he enlisted the aid of the world's most famous scientist, Albert Einstein, who agreed to place his illustrious signature on a letter to President Franklin Delano Roosevelt. The letter, dated August 2, 1939, was restrained and matter-of-fact. It informed the president that recent scientific work had revealed the probability of creating extremely powerful bombs of a new type through a nuclear chain reaction in a large mass of uranium. Interestingly, Einstein himself hadn't been keeping up with the latest developments. He was comfortably settled at the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, absorbed in his own theoretical work. When Szilard filled him in on fission and chain reactions, Einstein responded, "I never thought of that." He had known of the energy locked inside the atom, but he had told a journalist only a few months earlier that it would remain inaccessible for the foreseeable future. Still, Szilard recalled, he was very quick to see the implications. Unfortunately, late summer 1939 turned out to be a bad time to be writing letters to the president. On September 1st, Germany invaded Poland, and the world plunged into the Second World War. It wasn't until mid-October that the letter finally reached Roosevelt. He got the point immediately. "What you're after is to see that the Nazis don't blow us up," he told his aide. "This requires action." Yet not much happened for some time, but throughout 1940 and 1941, slowly but steadily, momentum developed. An official British report stated that it will be possible to make an effective uranium bomb. Still, the United States dragged its heels. It was not yet at war after all. That changed on December 7th, 1941, with the attack on Pearl Harbor. On January 19th, 1942, Roosevelt officially authorized the atomic bomb project. In August, the effort received its official designation, the Manhattan Engineering District, or as it became more commonly known, the Manhattan Project. But how do you even begin to build such a thing? It was clear, scientifically speaking, that an atomic bomb was possible, but no one actually knew how to do it. There were so many pieces to the puzzle. The first issue was the fuel. Scientific work had already established that naturally occurring uranium, uranium-238, wouldn't work. Its much rarer isotope, uranium-235, was needed, but natural uranium contains less than 1% of U-235, so some means had to be devised for separating and concentrating it. This was a far more complicated problem than it sounds. Separating two isotopes of the same element is incredibly difficult because they are chemically identical. The only difference between U-238 and U-235 is 3 neutrons. It's a tiny difference in mass. There were various ideas for how to do it: gaseous diffusion, electromagnetic separation, but whichever was chosen, it was clear that each would require huge, complex, expensive industrial plants. Figuring out how to build them, and where, would be one of the major tasks of the Manhattan Project. Another possibility had recently emerged from work at the University of California, Berkeley. The chemist Glenn Seaborg had discovered a new element beyond uranium, number 94, which would eventually be named plutonium. Experiments showed that plutonium could also be made to fission, so plutonium offered an alternative to uranium. It too would be pursued. Then there was the question of the actual design of the bomb. How would it work? What would it be made of? How big would it be? These were questions more for engineers than scientists, but they would have to work closely together. The two men who would lead the Manhattan Project represented both disciplines. The chief administrator was Colonel Leslie R. Groves of the Army Corps of Engineers. A hard-nosed, talented civil engineer, Groves had just finished building the Pentagon. He was a man greatly experienced in getting massive, complicated projects done. Taking charge in September 1942, Groves immediately set to work. He bought land for an isotope separation plant in eastern Tennessee, a place called Oak Ridge. He began securing supplies of uranium ore. As he charged around the country getting everything moving, he began to realize that the whole effort needed more centralization. There was a war on after all, and there was the matter of security. An obvious solution was a central laboratory located in some remote, isolated area. The man chosen to direct that laboratory was the Berkeley physicist J. Robert Oppenheimer. The 38-year-old Oppenheimer, known to all as Oppie, was already connected to the bomb effort. In the summer of 1942, he had led a study group to look at the details of how a bomb might be designed. Although they were polar opposites, Groves and Oppenheimer somehow took to each other. Groves liked the sophisticated physicist's practical attitude. From Oppenheimer's point of view, Groves seemed like just the no-nonsense type who could get the project done. Groves was confident in his intuition and decided he'd found his man. He bulldozed through various objections, including the fact that Oppenheimer had no administrative experience and had past political connections with leftist and communist elements. Such things didn't matter, Groves insisted. Oppenheimer was absolutely indispensable. Oppenheimer suggested a suitable site, atop a New Mexican mesa near Los Alamos, a region he knew well. Groves moved quickly to secure the land, and Oppenheimer embarked on a cross-country campaign to recruit its inhabitants. It was a true test of his charisma. He had to convince scientific colleagues to drop everything and move to some remote place he wasn't allowed to name, to do some kind of vital work he wasn't allowed to describe. All he could tell them was that they would be contributing to a project that might win the war. For many scientists who had become refugees from Nazi tyranny, that was enough incentive, and many, of course, were able to guess what they were being asked to do. Until Los Alamos was up and running, the major scientific work was centered at Berkeley and at the University of Chicago's Metallurgical Laboratory, where Fermi and Szilard had moved to work on achieving a controlled fission reaction by building the world's first nuclear reactor. Today, we think of reactors as sources of electric power, but in 1942, they provided a way to create plutonium. On December 2nd, 1942, in a makeshift lab under the squash courts at the university's Stagg Field, Fermi and his team achieved a controlled nuclear chain reaction for the first time. The event was not spectacular. No fuses burned, no lights flashed. They celebrated with cheap Chianti out of paper cups. Arthur Compton, the physicist in charge, called his colleague James Conant to inform him, in a prearranged code, that the Italian navigator has just landed in the New World. Despite the success, Szilard found himself feeling more somber than triumphant. He knew that now there would be atomic bombs. I shook hands with Fermi, he remembered, and I said I thought this day would go down as a black day in the history of mankind. With the establishment of huge industrial plants at Oak Ridge, Tennessee and Hanford, Washington, and the bomb design lab in New Mexico, the broad shape of the Manhattan Project was established. Los Alamos focused on building what they called, for security reasons, the gadget. That work eventually settled around two designs. The first and simplest was a gun design. One piece of subcritical uranium-235 would be fired like an artillery shell into another piece, creating a mass that would go supercritical and explode. Oppenheimer and his team were quite confident of this design. The second was implosion. Calculations showed that plutonium wouldn't work in the gun-type bomb, it would just fizzle. The only way to induce plutonium fission fast enough was to squeeze a subcritical amount into a much smaller, denser critical mass. This meant surrounding it on all sides with conventional explosives that were detonated simultaneously, creating a uniform pressure wave. But no one had ever done such a thing before. Los Alamos scientists had to create what they called explosive lenses, carefully calibrated assemblies of fast and slow explosives that could focus the blast wave inward, just as a lens focuses light. By the summer of 1943, the Los Alamos lab was fully staffed and running, involving over 5,000 people. Relatively few of them had any inkling of the big picture. As work continued throughout 1944, the biggest concern was whether there would be enough fissile material, whether uranium or plutonium, to actually build a weapon. Meanwhile, US troops were dying every day in Europe, and Japanese forces fought on ferociously in the Pacific. It was still unclear what progress Nazi Germany was making toward a bomb. What was apparent was that the war was far from over. The bomb had to be built, whatever the cost. So, if the original reason for the bomb had vanished with the defeat of Nazi Germany in May of 1945, why did the project continue with such relentless momentum? For some scientists, like Szilard, the end of the war in Europe presented a dilemma. The entire impetus for the bomb effort had been the fear of a Nazi weapon. An intelligence unit had followed Allied armies into Germany and found nothing but a disorganized, crude effort. Hitler had failed to recognize the potential of the bomb. So why, Szilard and others asked, should the effort to build a bomb continue? Why not suspend the project? Why not concentrate on nuclear energy for peaceful purposes? These were noble sentiments, but they were also futile. By this time, the Manhattan Project had a momentum of its own, a $2 billion inertia spurred on by years of total war. When Roosevelt died and was succeeded by Harry S. Truman, that momentum only intensified. Truman had been totally unaware of the project, but once informed, he saw no reason not to allow it to continue, especially as he looked ahead to the dark prospect of invading Japan. At Los Alamos, the end of the European war hardly slowed the work. Instead, preparations were underway to test the implosion weapon, for which enough plutonium would soon be available. A testing site was prepared in southern New Mexico, in a desert known as the Jornada del Muerto, the Journey of Death. The test device would sit atop a 100-foot steel tower, surrounded by equipment to measure every detail of the blast. The test was named Trinity. As the test approached on July the 15th, 1945, the weather was not cooperating. Heavy thunderstorms were predicted. No one really knew for certain whether the gadget would work at all, or if it did, how well. A betting pool was held on the size of the blast, with wagers ranging from total destruction to a complete dud. Finally, in the early hours of July the 16th, the meteorologist told Groves there would be a period of clearing around dawn, Trinity would go on. Then, at 5:29 and 45 seconds in the morning, the final relays were closed and the Trinity gadget detonated in a brilliant glare never before experienced on Earth. Reactions spanned the entire range of human emotion, from jubilation to deep satisfaction, to complete awe to abject horror. As befitting such a complex individual, Oppenheimer's reactions were ambiguous. He later recalled a quotation from the Hindu scripture flashing through his mind. "Now I am become death, the shatterer of worlds." At the time, however, as a bystander recollected, Oppenheimer was too physically and emotionally spent to say anything other than, "It worked." Events moved swiftly after that, and ecstatic Groves cabled the news to Truman, who soon passed it on in a guarded form to Stalin, telling him that the United States now possessed a new weapon of unusual destructive force. A seemingly unimpressed Stalin responded only that he hoped the United States would make good use of it against Japan. As Truman would learn much later, Stalin was already quite aware of the atomic bomb. Despite all of Groves's elaborate security precautions, Soviet spies had infiltrated the Manhattan Project. The first bomb, a gun-type device dubbed Little Boy, was dispatched to the Pacific. Another weapon, identical to the plutonium Trinity device, was also being prepared. Szilard circulated a petition urging the president to consider the moral implications of using the bomb on Japan without warning, but it was officially ignored. With the vicious Pacific War still raging and a weary population anxious for an end, any questions of forgoing the use of a now-proven superweapon were beyond serious discussion. A committee, which included Oppenheimer, considered staging a demonstration of the bomb, giving the Japanese a chance to perceive what awaited them. But the notion was rejected. What if the Japanese shot down the plane? What if the bomb was a dud? What if they refused to be suitably impressed? No, the committee concluded, the only course of action was to use the bomb by surprise without warning on a previously untouched Japanese city containing important military or industrial targets. Just after 8:15 in the morning, on August 6, 1945, a B-29 bomber named Enola Gay dropped the uranium gun bomb over Hiroshima. It detonated 1,850 feet over the city, with an explosive force of about 15,000 tons of TNT. The fireball, at about 300,000 degrees Fahrenheit, set the city afire. The blast flattened everything within a 2-mile radius. About 80,000 people were killed immediately. The secret was out. The force from which the sun draws its power has been loosed against those who brought war to the Far East, declared President Truman, promising a rain of ruin from the air, the like of which has never been seen on this earth. To emphasize that point, 3 days later, on August the 9th, another B-29 dropped Fat Man, a plutonium implosion bomb on Nagasaki. The 21-kiloton blast initially killed between 35 to 40,000 people. Later that day, the USSR also declared war on Japan. On August the 14th, 1945, the Japanese Empire surrendered unconditionally. The Second World War was finally over. The atomic age, however, had just begun. Suddenly, nuclear weapons were no longer science-fictional fantasies. They were real, and at first most people only cared that the war was over, and the United States was on top, the only nation in the world with the secret of the bomb. But with that supremacy came a unique set of responsibilities. Scientists warned that the principles of physics couldn't be restrained by security classifications. It would only be a matter of time before other nations discovered the same secrets of nature. Even before Hiroshima, visionaries like Szilard and Bohr tried to warn political leaders that some kind of international controls would have to be put into place to avoid an eventual atomic anarchy. With the recent founding of the United Nations, the framework was there to create a structure to, if not stuff the atomic genie back into its bottle, at least keep it from getting out of control. But as with most idealistic ventures, it would be far easier said than done. One of the great problems was trying to figure out just what these weapons meant. For most military thinkers, the bomb wasn't anything special, except in scale. A bigger bang for the buck. For others, including most of the scientists who had built it, the bomb was utterly different. There was a fundamental qualitative distinction. The ability to destroy an entire city at a single blow, was entirely new and required new ways of thinking. The reports from Hiroshima and Nagasaki of a strange new malady affecting the survivors emphasized the point. Manhattan Project scientists had known something of the dangers of radiation, but they thought the prompt radiation would be of little importance because most everyone who received a lethal dose would already have been killed by the heat and blast. They knew there would be residual radiation, fallout, but in the rush to build the weapon, there was little time to contemplate such matters. Now, the results were showing themselves in real human beings. Initial Japanese reports of an atomic bomb illness were dismissed by Groves as propaganda, but it was clear that here was a consequence of nuclear weapons that didn't exist with the conventional type. The public, too, was unsure what to think. As the euphoria of the war's end faded, anxiety took its place. The press offered a steady stream of tales about the wonders that would soon arrive as the atom was transformed from a weapon into a source of unlimited energy. But as political leaders knew, it wasn't really possible to completely separate the civilian atom from its military counterpart. Reactors for peaceful power could also be used to manufacture fuel for weapons. The first and most pressing issue was the USSR. Estimates varied on how soon a Soviet bomb might be developed. Oppenheimer thought it might take as little as 5 years. General Groves said 10 or even 20. But few expected America's atomic monopoly to last forever. In early 1946, Truman appointed a committee to consider the control of atomic energy. Hopes ran high that a practical structure could be worked out. Those hopes were tied to fears that had grown as the full tragedies of Hiroshima and Nagasaki became more widely known. It was one thing to contemplate the devastation of unfamiliar foreign cities, but quite another to ponder lurid images of familiar landmarks like the Empire State Building consumed in nuclear fire. The committee proposed an international agency to administer research and possess sole control over the world's stockpiles of nuclear materials. The agency would have broad powers of inspection. After these proposals went into effect, the United States would give up its nuclear monopoly. Following some modifications, the plan was presented to the United Nations. It enjoyed a generally positive response from most quarters, save one, the Soviet Union. The Soviets didn't quite believe American assurances. It didn't help that the United States was simultaneously preparing its first post-war atomic test series, Operation Crossroads, in the Pacific. If the United States was so sincere, the Soviets asked, why was it planning to explode more atomic bombs? The remainder of 1946 was spent in endless harsh negotiation. Tensions and distrust between the United States and the USSR only increased. By the end of the year, it was clear that the first major efforts at nuclear disarmament had collapsed. It had been a noble quest, but a brief opportunity that would never quite repeat itself. Meanwhile, the science and technology of nuclear weapons were only accelerating. The Los Alamos laboratory continued to operate, improving and perfecting fission weapons. The idea of the hydrogen bomb, the super, though proving challenging, hadn't gone away, kept alive by its tireless champion, Edward Teller. As the United States began to gain some distance from Hiroshima, some started to challenge the official narrative that the bomb had been necessary to end the war. If we had undertaken the project out of fear of Hitler, why did we continue after Germany surrendered? These and other troubling questions were encouraged by newly organized groups like the Federation of Atomic Scientists. Any hopes that research could now concentrate on peaceful applications was soon tempered by the ever-intensifying Cold War. As the USSR tightened its grip on Eastern Europe, the United States declared a policy of containment to prevent the spread of communism, with the implication that the atomic bomb would be its guarantor. Even when facing challenges like the 1947-48 blockade of West Berlin, the United States and its allies could rest assured that the atomic bomb stood ready, which made the question of when the Soviets might get the bomb ever more pressing. The newly formed CIA watched and waited. Finally, on September 3rd, 1949, a specially equipped reconnaissance plane detected radioactive dust particles blowing out of the Soviet Union. The particles showed the telltale isotopic signature of an atomic explosion. The USSR had the bomb. President Truman announced the Russian bomb to the world on September the 23rd. Behind the scenes, some were panicking at the supposed loss of US nuclear supremacy. Teller, who hadn't expected a Russian bomb quite so soon, was agitated. He soon realized that rather than a disaster, the Soviet bomb now presented him with the perfect opportunity to push his pet project, the hydrogen bomb. Research on the H-bomb had been continuing at a low level, but with no sense of urgency. For Teller and others, the Soviet bomb changed everything. It didn't matter that the United States still had more bombs. Atomic equity on any level was an unacceptable existential threat. The clear answer was to regain absolute superiority by building the hydrogen bomb. But it wasn't so obvious to some. Another opportunity to control the spread of atomic weapons in a dangerous arms race had already been lost. Here was another chance for the world to forgo a terrible weapon that might lead to ultimate disaster. It was a chance to do so before such a weapon even existed. This wouldn't be the rest of the world renouncing something that only the United States had. It was a way to choose peace over possible thermonuclear war. The question was scientific, political, and moral, all inextricably mixed. The government turned to its scientists, the General Advisory Committee of the Atomic Energy Commission, chaired by Oppenheimer. Over the Halloween weekend of 1949, the GAC considered, debated, and finally came to definite conclusions. They recommended increasing the production of fissile material and accelerating research on boosted atomic weapons. But one recommendation was not going to be popular. Although not opposing further research on the hydrogen bomb, the GC unanimously recommended against any kind of crash program to build it. Their arguments were reasonable. It would divert resources from the existing atomic stockpile to a project that might not even work. The United States already had hundreds of atomic bombs, sufficient to meet any conceivable threat. And if the H-bomb could be built, what would be its purpose? It would be so powerful it could only be used on cities, more a genocidal device than a practical military weapon. Several GAC members called it an evil thing considered in any light. The final decision, of course, rested with the president. Truman faced enormous pressure from the military and hawkish influences within his administration, and communist influence continued to spread. A newly communist China formed a seemingly united red menace. Communist spies were suddenly appearing everywhere. In England, Klaus Fuchs, a physicist who had worked at Los Alamos, confessed to spying for the Soviet Union. In such a climate, it wasn't surprising that on January 31st, 1950, Truman announced, "I have directed the Atomic Energy Commission to continue its work on all forms of atomic weapons, including the so-called hydrogen or super bomb." When the Cold War went hot with the invasion of South Korea in June 1950, the urgency of achieving the H-bomb seemed even more necessary. The problem was that no one actually knew how to do it. Intricate calculations, now possible thanks to new electronic computers, soon demonstrated that the initial concept of the H-bomb, the classical super, was unworkable. It seemed for a time that the hydrogen bomb would remain a fascinating but impossible scientific idea. But in 1951, the mathematician Stanislaw Ulam came up with a new design. Teller and Ulam further refined the idea into what became known as the Ulam-Teller configuration. By late 1952, the concept was ready to be tested. It wasn't yet an operational weapon. The 65-ton apparatus filled a large structure on the tiny island of Elugalab in the Pacific. Shortly before dawn on November 1st, 1952, the device was detonated in the world's first thermonuclear explosion. The small island was vaporized by just over 10 megatons of energy, with a fireball 3 miles in diameter. The United States had its hydrogen bomb. It was back on top. Unfortunately, that comforting sense of superiority would not last long. Less than a year later, on August 12, 1953, the Soviet Union detonated its own thermonuclear weapon. Again, there was a hue and cry over espionage. But just as the USSR had been working on its own atomic bomb before Hiroshima, its gifted scientists, chief among them Igor Kurchatov and Andrei Sakharov, had also been working on the hydrogen bomb concept. Espionage certainly helped, but the notion that the Russians had simply stolen the American bombs was a complete misconception. Now both the United States and the USSR had the hydrogen bomb, a weapon that could wipe out an entire urban area at one blow. The floodgates of unlimited testing were unlocked. In January 1951, the testing program expanded to include the continental United States with the establishment of the Nevada test site. It was the opening salvo of a series of continental atomic tests that would continue for over a decade, testing weapons designs, effects, and the psychological reactions of US troops exposed to nuclear detonations at close range. The big weapons, the H-bombs in the megaton range, were reserved for the more remote Pacific test areas. Fallout was one of the phenomena that made nuclear weapons more frightening. The idea of radiation, something that can't be sensed, but could be dangerous and even fatal, was a particular concern. Official reassurances were going to directly conflict with physical realities. That happened with the test of the United States' first practical hydrogen bomb in the Bravo test on Bikini Atoll on March 1st, 1954. Bravo surprised everyone. Instead of the predicted 5 megatons, it was a 15 megaton monster. Shifting wind patterns sent the unexpectedly huge cloud of fallout over vast unprepared areas, including one where a Japanese fishing vessel, the Lucky Dragon, had been working. The 23 crew members were doused with debris and soon became ill with radiation sickness. One of them later died. It was an unprecedented public relations disaster, leading to an outcry that was impossible to ignore. The Castle Bravo incident proved to be the impetus for a worldwide grassroots campaign against nuclear testing. In 1955, the philosopher Bertrand Russell and Einstein released a joint statement warning of the dangers of hydrogen warfare. Radioactive fallout from bombs being routinely exploded in the open air, working its way into our food, our milk, and the bodies of our children, was happening now. And the authorities didn't seem to care. As if to emphasize the futility of any ideas of control, the bomb began to spread. Britain became the third nuclear power in 1952, followed by France in 1960. All along, the superpowers continued to steadily increase their arsenals. The atomic age had started with fear, but also with a thread of hopefulness that it might be possible to transform this terrible weapon into a force for good. Those dreams now seemed naive. Even though the United States and USSR agreed to an informal moratorium on testing in 1958, the USSR broke it in 1961. So the bomb was here, and it would remain. As the 1950s passed into the 1960s, the world seemed to be on an ever-accelerating course towards self-destruction. More than once, the always simmering tensions between the United States and USSR threatened to boil over into the apocalyptic war that everyone feared, but no one really wanted. But what happens when that cold, hard logic of deterrence breaks down? What happens when human fallibility, fear, and miscalculation enter the equation? By the mid-1950s, the bomb had shifted from a novel phenomenon into an ever-present part of everyday life. The sharp lines between East and West had become defined. It was us versus them, and there was no greater symbol of that reality than nuclear weapons. Before the hydrogen bomb, there had been talk of using atomic weapons. During the Berlin blockade, specially modified B-29s were deployed to Britain as a veiled warning to Stalin. It was an empty gesture, as the planes weren't carrying bombs. When communist Chinese troops entered the Korean War, President Truman publicly hinted at a possible use of atomic weapons. President Eisenhower also considered using tactical nuclear weapons against the Chinese. Such proposals never moved beyond hypothetical planning, but they were a sign that the taboo against using nuclear weapons had not quite set in. The hydrogen bomb, however, changed the game. Its sheer power put it in a wholly different class. Thermonuclear warfare was all or nothing. With East and West settled into this confrontation, continually adding to their arsenals, it was inevitable that this uneasy stability would occasionally be tested. Some tests would be minor, some would remain buried in secrecy for decades, and others would be experienced by the entire world. Some were resolved through adept diplomacy, but many avoided disaster only through sheer luck. Aside from being the first time East and West had directly clashed militarily, the Korean War was the first instance in which the United States had to face the reality that it could no longer decide to use nuclear weapons with impunity. Eisenhower knew that the United States had to take into account the probable reaction of the USSR, either direct nuclear retaliation or a Soviet invasion of Western Europe. Whichever happened, it meant likely escalation to a full-scale world war. The same considerations held for later confrontations over Taiwan and in the Middle East. By the late 1950s, another source of constant tension emerged, a false attack warning. For the first decade of the Cold War, bombers needed hours to reach their targets. That allowed some time for contemplation, but this relatively comfortable status quo began to change rapidly when the Soviets tested their first intercontinental ballistic missile, or ICBM, in 1957, and then launched the world's first satellite, Sputnik. The ominous lesson was that the USSR now had the capability to hurl hydrogen warheads down on North America. ICBMs were not only unstoppable, but they could reach their targets in less than an hour. The short window of warning was gone. Now armed with more nuclear weapons than ever, the American Strategic Air Command and its Soviet counterparts were poised on constant alert. With warning times cut from hours to minutes, the chance for a fatal error increased exponentially. This also encouraged both sides to devise new ways to preserve their capacity to retaliate. For the Soviet Union, a nation traumatized by the Nazi invasion, this was a particularly sensitive problem. Unlike the United States, the USSR didn't have conveniently situated allies on whose territory to place its missiles. Its decision to finally correct that strategic deficiency with a risky gamble led to the greatest crisis of the Cold War. When the revolutionary Fidel Castro first came to power in Cuba in 1959, he kept the world guessing. But by the time Kennedy became president, Castro had set up his own oppressive government and declared Cuba a socialist ally of the Soviet Union. The Soviet leader, Nikita Khrushchev, soon took advantage of the opportunity. In the spring of 1962, he decided that he would secretly deploy nuclear missiles on the island. Not only would this help ensure Cuba's security, but it would give the USSR a quantum leap in strategic advantage. It was a risky move, but Khrushchev gambled that he could pull it off. Throughout the summer of 1962, the USSR moved missiles, people and equipment to Cuba, disguised as routine cargo. On October 14, 1962, a U-2 spy plane flew over western Cuba and photographed launch sites under construction. Also clearly visible were launchers, support equipment, and medium-range ballistic missiles, enough to put Washington, D.C. within easy range. Kennedy wasted no time calling together a team of top-level advisors, dubbed the Executive Committee, or EXCOM. The first reaction was astonishment and anger. The United States had caught the Soviet deception before the missiles were operational, but work was continuing around the clock. The window of opportunity to take action was closing rapidly. The most impulsive option was an immediate military attack on the launch sites, but airstrikes couldn't ensure complete destruction and would have to be followed by an invasion. Moreover, any military action meant killing not only Cubans but Russian nationals. How would Khrushchev react? Diplomacy was another possibility, but the Soviets could waste time pretending to negotiate while work on the sites went on. A third option emerged, a naval blockade to prevent further missiles from reaching Cuba. It was an imperfect solution, technically an act of war, but less drastic than an open attack. Kennedy decided on the blockade, describing it with the softer term quarantine. One way or another, Kennedy resolved Soviet missiles were not going to remain in Cuba. For the first week, the situation remained secret. That changed on Monday evening, October the 22nd, when Kennedy addressed the nation. He announced that offensive missile sites were in preparation on Cuba. In response, the United States was imposing a quarantine, placing its forces on increased alert and calling for diplomatic action. Most importantly, Kennedy warned, "It shall be the policy of this nation to regard any nuclear missile launched from Cuba against any nation in the Western Hemisphere as an attack by the Soviet Union on the United States, requiring a full retaliatory response upon the Soviet Union." The lines had been drawn. The Cold War had suddenly become a real and present danger. As the US Navy deployed its quarantine and Soviet supply ships approached, the stage for direct military confrontation was set. US forces were placed on DEFCON 3, then 2 days later, raised to DEFCON 2, one step away from actual war. That was the precipice on which both nations balanced on Wednesday, October the 24th. Russian warships were also present in the form of submarines which, unknown to the United States until many years later, were armed with nuclear-tipped torpedoes. For a few tense hours, it seemed that the first shots of the Third World War would be fired at sea. But somehow, both sides pulled back. Russian vessels either turned around or submitted to inspection. The first test of the Cuban Missile Crisis passed. In the words of Secretary of State Dean Rusk, both sides were eyeball to eyeball, and the other fellow just blinked. That sense of relief didn't last. More Russian ships were approaching. Work on the missile sites showed no signs of slowing. Much of the world remained unconvinced of the US allegations. On October the 25th at the United Nations, the US Ambassador Adlai Stevenson openly displayed a series of the U-2 photos, revealing the unmistakable evidence. By the end of the week, the crisis had bifurcated into public and secret threads. The secret thread was the correspondence between Kennedy and Khrushchev. Communications was still slow, relying on cable messages that took hours to encrypt, transmit, and translate. On Friday, October the 26th, Khrushchev dispatched a long personal letter. He proposed a possible solution. He would remove the missiles in exchange for the removal of the quarantine and a US pledge to never invade Cuba. It seemed to offer the first real possibility out of the impasse. Then, a second, more terse public communique arrived. It added the condition that the United States remove its analogous nuclear weapons from Turkey. Then two more incidents pushed aside thoughts of political complications. The US U-2 on an air sampling mission accidentally strayed across the Arctic frontier of the USSR. The tense incident highlighted the fact that it was impossible to control every move of large military forces. As Kennedy remarked, "There's always some son of a bitch that doesn't get the word." The second mishap didn't end so innocuously. Another U-2 conducting reconnaissance over Cuba was shot down, and its pilot, Major Rudolph Anderson Jr., was killed by a Soviet surface-to-air missile. Blood had been spilled. War now seemed closer than at any other point. US forces were amassing in Florida for an invasion. SAC bombers were stationed around the borders of the USSR, fully armed. After spending most of the day conferring, Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara recalled leaving the White House late that Black Saturday night and wondering whether he would live to see the sun come up the next morning. Yet the sun did rise, and with it came a new message from Khrushchev in a public radio broadcast. He announced that he had ordered the dismantling of the Cuban missile bases and the return of all missiles and warheads to the Soviet Union. Khrushchev's reversal wasn't a complete capitulation. In a confidential response, Kennedy had agreed to a pledge not to invade Cuba and secretly to remove US missiles from Turkey some months later. But for the world at large, the rapprochement meant everyone could relax. The nerve-wracking 13 days were over. The most immediate result was a distinct lessening of Cold War tensions, at least for a time. Both sides had crept to the very edge of eternity, peered over, and abruptly withdrawn. Realizing the critical need for faster communications, the US and USSR established a dedicated hotline between Washington and Moscow. They also signed the Limited Test Ban Treaty in 1963, banning all nuclear tests in the atmosphere, underwater, or in space. But there were negatives. Hardliners within the Soviet government chastised Khrushchev for weakness and eventually forced him out of office. And one of the most significant consequences was a Soviet resolve to never again find itself in such an inferior position. The lesson Kennedy and Khrushchev drew was the need to reduce tensions. The new communist leaders came to the opposite conclusion. The USSR had been forced to back down because the United States held military superiority. The only possible response was an all-out effort to achieve strategic equity. As new information became known in the following years, the chilling realities of the crisis came into sharper focus. Kennedy had cautioned his colleagues to avoid any talk of winning. He considered it arrogant. The world had avoided nuclear war largely because of sheer luck. McNamara confirmed that judgment decades later. It was luck that prevented nuclear war, he reflected. We came that close. Rational individuals came that close to the total destruction of their societies, and that danger exists today. We now know a number of other incidents occurred. On October the 26th, the United States launched an unarmed Atlas ICBM from California. Both sides also proceeded with previously scheduled nuclear tests. Under SAC's increased alert, some safety procedures were disregarded. Defensive systems generated false radar reports. On Sunday, October the 28th, a radar station in New Jersey picked up an apparent missile launch from Cuba. It turned out to be a test tape running on the system. We also learned years later that small tactical nuclear weapons were present in Cuba, intended for use on the beaches against an invading army. If US troops had attempted to land, local commanders had the authority to stop them by nuking the beachhead. It would have been a limited use, but it would have crossed the invisible line between conventional and nuclear war. Once that threshold was crossed, escalation would have been practically inevitable. The Cuban Missile Crisis continues to be one of the most intensely studied episodes in human history, and for good reason. It nearly ended human history. And while it is universally acknowledged to be the occasion in which all-out nuclear war was most likely, similar occasions have transpired since then, most far less visible. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect of these other incidents is that they occurred wholly outside of public awareness. More than once, the world briefly teetered on the edge while only a handful of military personnel knew anything about what was happening. In November 1979, a training tape was mistakenly fed into NORAD's computer systems, giving false warning of a Soviet attack. In June 1980, a flawed computer chip caused a similar frantic response. In these and other episodes, a tightly wound response system had simply been reacting as designed, almost automatically, with a minimum of human intervention, because in a real war there would be only minutes between warning and decision. Then there are the simple accidents, the broken arrows. In 1961, a B-52 bomber flying over North Carolina broke up in mid-air, dropping 2 hydrogen bombs. Declassified documents revealed that one of the bombs had come perilously close to detonating. In 1966, another B-52 collided with a refueling aircraft over Palomares, Spain. The 4 hydrogen bombs it was carrying fell to Earth. In 1968, another bomber crashed near Thule, Greenland, again carrying 4 hydrogen bombs. In all of these cases, the conventional explosives inside the weapons went off, scattering radioactive material, but no nuclear detonation occurred. These incidents were so alarming that they convinced the United States to cancel the 24-hour airborne alert program in 1968. In all these scenarios, beyond the technical aspects, the common denominator is perception. How the intentions of one side are perceived by the other, and the mistakes that occur when those intentions are misperceived. It's only prudent to be prepared for the worst, because if the worst is true, there will be no second chance. Where nuclear weapons are concerned, the concept of the benefit of the doubt does not exist. It's a sobering thought, isn't it? That for all the intricate theories of deterrence and grand strategies, our continued existence is so often hung by the thread of pure chance, a malfunctioning computer chip, or the calm decision of a single individual in a control room. It forces us to confront the physical reality of what these weapons actually do, not as abstract concepts but as physical events in our world. So what does happen when a nuclear weapon explodes? What would one experience? The specific phenomena can vary depending on the type of weapon, fission or fusion, and where it's detonated. But there are several major things that take place in every nuclear detonation. When the radioactive heart of the weapon goes supercritical, the nuclear fuel heats within milliseconds to a temperature of tens of millions of degrees, hotter than the sun's core. Everything in the immediate vicinity, including the weapon itself, is transformed into a state of matter called a plasma, which instantly begins to expand in a spherical mass called a fireball. A broad spectrum of electromagnetic radiation streaks outward. To a human observer, this light is the initial manifestation and will instantaneously blind anyone unfortunate enough to be oriented directly towards it. This flash travels at the speed of the light. Accompanying this is a thermal pulse, heat, that completely vaporizes everything within the fireball and everything it touches as it expands. The heat is so intense that it will burn everything in the vicinity and up to miles away. Much of the damage at Hiroshima and Nagasaki came not from the blast, but simply from burns and fire. The fireball cools and rises, but the thermal pulse is immediately followed by the shock wave, consisting of superheated and supercompressed air hurtling outward. The shock wave acts like a conventional explosion, yet is far faster and more powerful, raising everything in its reach, moving at supersonic speed as a wall of wind more destructive than any hurricane. In addition to the heat and shock wave, intense gamma and X-ray radiation spreads outward, but few of the people immediately killed by a nuclear explosion are victims of radiation, simply because they are already killed by the shock wave or thermal pulse before the radiation can claim them. Most lethal radiation effects come later, in the residual radiation, as debris swept up into the radioactive cloud falls back to the ground as fallout. One signature known to everyone is the mushroom cloud. Such clouds aren't unique to nuclear explosions, but they are invariably associated with them. The mushroom forms when the extremely hot fireball rises into the air, drawing the much cooler air below up into the expanding cloud. Along with this rush of incoming air comes dirt and debris, which is sucked up and circulates within. This forms the top of the mushroom, with the debris still being drawn upward, forming the stem. The speed and shape of the cloud will vary, but some type of mushroom cloud almost always appears. What happens when all these effects take place not in a testing ground, but in the heart of a major city? A nuclear blast packs within it every variety of natural disaster at its worst, within the smallest span of time. We have many accounts from those who experienced it. William L. Lawrence, the journalist at the Trinity test, wrote of "a light not of this world, the light of many suns in one, a great green super sun." Rising as it was expanding, an elemental force freed from its bonds. The survivors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki recall it differently. A tremendous flash of light cut across the sky, one remembered. It seemed a sheet of sun. He felt a sudden pressure, and then splinters and pieces of board and fragments of tile fell on him. He heard no roar. Another said, everything flashed whiter than any white she had ever seen. Everything became dark, for she was buried. An attack on a major city would likely be an airburst, to spread the destructive power over the widest area. Everything within the fireball would simply cease to exist. Extending outward, the destruction would be almost total within several miles of ground zero. Immediate casualties would be victims of blast and heat. Radiation casualties would follow. For the first hours and days, the survivors would be largely on their own. Streets, roads, bridges, all access would be destroyed or impassable. Communications networks would be gone. Hospitals and medical facilities would be wiped out. If an attack were limited to a single city, aid would eventually pour in. But in a major attack involving the entire nation, there may be no outside to provide assistance. The psychological and social impact would be far more significant than the hundreds of thousands of deaths. We had a preview of this after the 9/11 attacks. That national trauma led to new wars abroad and more intrusive security measures at home. All this came as a result of approximately 3,000 deaths, a mere fraction of those who would perish in any nuclear attack. It's not hard to imagine that in the aftermath of such a disaster, people would readily submit to draconian measures to guarantee their safety. This abstractedness, this separation from the visceral reality, has made nuclear weapons a subject for endless theorizing. Unlike any other subject with such all-encompassing significance, much of this discussion has taken place well out of the awareness of the public, from behind a curtain of secrecy. It's a story that begins long before anyone knew an atomic weapon could actually be built. But after Hiroshima, when the bomb had proven itself, political leaders and military men began seriously thinking about how to use these weapons and how to prevent them from being used against them. At first, for the United States, matters were simple. Since only the United States had the bomb, it held unquestioned dominance. Some officials even advocated a preventive war against the Soviet Union. Fortunately, such proposals were never taken seriously. By 1950, with the Soviet bomb a reality and war in Korea, the basic doctrinal outlines of the Cold War had formed, centered around a concept called deterrence. In its most elemental form, we learn about deterrence on the playground. If someone hits you, you hit them back. The bigger and stronger you are, the less likely it is that someone will hit you for fear of retaliation. In nuclear terms, that means ever greater numbers of ever better weapons. Your enemy is deterred from attacking because they know it will cause overwhelming retaliation. The downside is that this provides a strong incentive for them to overcome that handicap by building enough weapons to preempt your retaliation. This, in turn, forces you to build even more weapons, thus embarking on an ever-expanding arms race. Why not settle for a rough parity? That would seem logical, but it fails to account for human nature. Both sides would have to trust each other enough not to cheat. Deterrence was first officially articulated in the Eisenhower administration's policy of massive retaliation. This was part of his new look defense posture, which chose to rely on nuclear versus conventional weapons. It also had an economic rationale. It was relatively cheaper to maintain a nuclear deterrent than vast conventional forces. The Soviet Union, of course, wasn't sitting still. It steadily built up its own arsenal. Because its weapon designs tended to lag behind, its bombs were heavier and larger. This forced the USSR to find ways to circumvent the problem, which meant putting them atop missiles rather than in aeroplanes. By the time the Soviets demonstrated their missile prowess with Sputnik, the game had suddenly changed. A secret report claimed that the USSR would soon have a missile force able to devastate the United States. Because of this missile gap, the next few years would be years of maximum danger. But deterrence is also a matter of perception and psychology. As U-2 spy flights proved, the supposed missile gap favoured not the USSR but the United States. Spurred by its anxieties, the US quickly surpassed Soviet missile technology, developing missiles that could be launched from submarines. This led to the concept of the strategic triad, a three-pronged retaliatory capability of land-based ICBMs, submarine-based missiles, and manned bombers. One or even two parts might be taken out, but to eliminate all three would be practically impossible, thus preserving deterrence. For some strategists, this also meant that nuclear war no longer had to be an all-or-nothing proposition. Perhaps now it would be possible to have flexible options. For President Kennedy and Robert McNamara, that seemed attractive. This led to the idea of differentiating between counter-force targets, strictly military, and counter-value targets, civilian cities and industrial centres. The point was to attempt to limit the devastation. Counter-force targets would be hit first. Counter-value targets could be saved as bargaining chips. It all sounded quite rational. The problem, of course, was that human beings are often irrational. There was no way to guarantee the Soviet Union would behave according to McNamara's reasoning. By the mid-1960s, the USSR had achieved a rough strategic parity with the United States. A sort of stability had been achieved via MAD, mutual assured destruction. Now any attack would mean not just retaliation, but the total destruction of the attacker's country. Yet rather than settle for this uneasy status quo, both sides continued to vie for a decisive edge. One way was to build more weapons, another was technological innovation. Two major developments challenged the foundations of deterrence. One was defensive, the anti-ballistic missile, or ABM. One of the basic tenets of deterrence is the idea of vulnerability. You accept that you are subject to retaliation, but what if you could defend yourself? Because nuclear weapons are so terrible, the only defense is preventing an attack in the first place. Against nuclear weapons, only a perfect defense is enough. An imperfect defense can still save lives, but can't prevent catastrophe. In the 1960s, with missiles and sophisticated radar, came the concept of shooting ICBMs down. Both the US and USSR started developing ABM systems, despite the immense technical challenges. As far as deterrence was concerned, the technical realities were less important than the perceptual effects. A nation with a working ABM system might feel confident enough to strike first. Thus, the ABM issue spawned the second major destabilizing innovation, the Multiple Independently Targetable Reentry Vehicle, or MIRV. With MIRV, an ICBM carries several nuclear warheads, each of which can be individually guided to a separate target. This immensely complicates any defense. An ABM system would be overwhelmed. These two technologies, ABM and MIRV, created other problems. They provided greater incentives to strike first. The reluctant acknowledgement of a rough parity and the ultimate impossibility of achieving any lasting supremacy led both sides to seek another way out. The test moratorium and the 1963 Limited Test Ban Treaty were the first steps. Then came the 1968 Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. But these did nothing to control or reduce the weapons themselves. In 1972, after extensive negotiations, the US and USSR signed the Strategic Arms Limitation Talks, or SALT Treaty and the ABM Treaty. SALT placed some limitations on missiles, while the ABM Treaty limited both sides to one ABM site each. In reality, neither side was making significant concessions, but that was partly the point. It was enough to restore some sense of stability. The mere fact that both sides were talking was a hopeful development. In the 1980s, under the Reagan administration, there was a massive expansion of defense spending. There was no more talk of détente. Again fashionable was the idea that it was possible to not only limit but actually win a nuclear war. Such notions alarmed many others, most notably large segments of the public. A new wave of grassroots anti-nuclear campaigning sprung up, rallying around a concept called the nuclear freeze, a simple halt on building more weapons. This, advocates asserted, would reduce tensions and allow serious negotiations to proceed. Providing more force to the peace campaigns was new research by scientists like Carl Sagan, suggesting that a large-scale nuclear war would cause a nuclear winter. The massive amounts of soot and smoke would lead to a global drop in temperature, altering the Earth's climate for an indefinite period. Even if one survived the war, they would be faced with a cold, twilight purgatory. The nuclear freeze was gaining traction when it was essentially diffused by a Reagan administration initiative that shocked everyone. On March 13, 1983, Reagan delivered a speech proposing the development of a dedicated ballistic missile defense system that would render these weapons impotent and obsolete. His Strategic Defense Initiative, or SDI, was almost immediately dubbed Star Wars. It was a brilliant political move. Reagan was arguing not for offense but for defense. He had become horrified on learning the realities of nuclear weapons and was committed to finding a means to control them. He had been convinced by scientists like Teller that a technical solution was possible. Many other scientists maintained just the opposite. Intercepting thousands of missiles was a problem far beyond any foreseeable technology. The SDI also struck at the very heart of deterrence by undermining vulnerability, the same concerns that had led to the ABM Treaty. Soviet anxieties about the SDI were real. The USSR knew it could not hope to develop a comparable system. The attempt to counter the SDI was a major factor leading to the collapse of the Soviet Union. In fact, the refusal of the United States to forgo the SDI probably cost the world its only real chance to date of completely abolishing nuclear weapons. That came in 1986 at Reykjavik, Iceland. President Reagan and the Soviet chairman Mikhail Gorbachev almost agreed on something that for 40 years had been unthinkable: complete and mutual nuclear disarmament over a period of 10 years. Both leaders were sincere. It seemed too good to be true, and it was. Gorbachev's one condition was that the United States had to limit its SDI program to the laboratory. Reagan was unwilling to agree. He insisted the SDI posed no threat. They were unable to reach a compromise, and the opportunity slipped away. All wasn't lost, however. The rapport between them led to the Intermediate-Range Nuclear Forces Treaty in the following year, which eliminated an entire category of nuclear weapons. Then came the Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty, or START. Unlike SALT, which only limited weapons, START required both sides to actually reduce their arsenals. With the end of the Cold War, nuclear weapons passed into history in the minds of many people. But the thousands of nukes didn't simply vanish. The breakup of the Soviet Union temporarily increased the number of nuclear powers as the former republics of Ukraine, Belarus and Kazakhstan inherited the weapons on their territories. A concerted joint effort with the Russian government, the Cooperative Threat Reduction Program, secured what were now known as loose nukes. The arsenals were destroyed or removed. But new concerns soon arose. The possibility of nuclear war on a smaller scale increased between nations that either already had weapons or were striving to acquire them, and a new threat had appeared: international terrorism. While deterrence may affect nation-states, it's of no concern to terrorists. So why are we still here? How did we survive all those decades since Nagasaki without a nuclear weapon being used in anger? Some claim deterrence worked, others argue we were only lucky. Any of the many crises could have easily gone the other way. Still others say it came down to some ineffable quality of the human soul, something that stays the hand of those with the power to press the button. Maybe a powerful nuclear taboo had arisen. Whatever the answer, it might not last forever. One lesson driven home to smaller nations was that possession of the bomb imbues international prestige. Nuclear ambitions long restrained were now unshackled. Proliferation became a growth industry. And then there is the question of terrorist nuclear weapons. The basic principles of how to build a bomb are open source information. A Princeton student designed one in 1976 using publicly available material. Fortunately, acquiring the enriched uranium or plutonium fuel is the biggest hurdle. Both are perhaps the most closely guarded resources on the planet. But it hasn't discouraged terrorists or rogue states. They are among the most motivated and patient individuals in the world. And even with sufficient fuel, it's an extremely complex undertaking. This doesn't eliminate the danger, but it emphasizes that the scenario is more complicated than is sometimes portrayed. And of course, as long as the weapons exist, so will the option of someone deciding to use them, not out of madness or by mistake, but by a conscious, reasoned decision. Which raises another question. Do nuclear weapons have any practical use after all? Is the reason none have been used since Nagasaki simply because no one has managed to find a purpose for them, aside from preventing others from using them? After all this time, is it possible they are simply obsolete? And if so, why are we still keeping them around? The advent of the hydrogen bomb made it harder to justify them as just another military tool, but many still claimed smaller weapons could be employed for tactical purposes. And yet, when opportunities arose, no one took that step. They threatened, they made preparations, but they always backed off. Why? Could it be that those who had to make the decision realized that the certainty of what these weapons would do was outweighed by the awful uncertainty of what might follow, that nuclear weapons were actually essentially useless and therefore not worth it? In the 21st century, guidance and targeting technology have achieved enormous sophistication. Smart bombs, laser-guided munitions, autonomous drones can zero in on a single building. If the objective is to take out a particular headquarters, it's not necessary to blanket the entire area. So what's the military utility of a weapon that levels hundreds of square miles? In other words, no one's used nuclear weapons because they are just very big bombs, so big that they are basically useless in any practical sense. Their main utility is psychological. We perceive them as harbingers of doomsday, which makes them tools with which to threaten and coerce, while also making us hesitant to actually use them. But this also provides us with an opportunity. As President Kennedy said, "Our problems are man-made, therefore they can be solved by man." No problem of human destiny is beyond human beings. Can the problem of nuclear weapons be solved? The concept of completely eliminating them is not new. The chief objection is that the bomb can't be uninvented. Even if every weapon were destroyed, the knowledge to build them can't be expunged. All it would take is for one nation or one group to build another. But if a technology cannot be forgotten, it can still be controlled. If its devices cannot be eliminated, they can still be reduced in numbers and importance. There is an overwhelming incentive to strive for a goal of complete abolition, even if it's ultimately unattainable. In a widely influential editorial in 2007, 4 senior American statesmen, including William Perry and Henry Kissinger, called for a world free of nuclear weapons. They warned that, unless urgent new actions are taken, the US soon will be compelled to enter a new nuclear era that will be more precarious, psychologically disorienting, and economically even more costly than was Cold War deterrence. For several years there seemed to be hopeful signs. Unfortunately, that vision has faded. At a public discussion in 2016, Perry said, "The likelihood of a nuclear catastrophe today is greater than it was at any time since the Cuban Missile Crisis. The world seems to be moving in the opposite direction from any implementation of their proposals. Still, we have faced dangerous times before and survived them." Recently, humanity confronted and ultimately prevailed over the worst global pandemic in a century. That doesn't guarantee we will continue to be so fortunate, but whether or not ultimate abolition is possible, there are concrete practical steps that can be taken to reduce the dangers. These include reducing arsenals from hair-trigger alert status, continuing to work for substantial arms reductions, and increasing the security of existing weapons and fuel. But taking those steps requires acknowledging the urgency of the threats. In a world where the existence of nuclear weapons has become an accepted part of civilization, the first challenge is increasing public awareness. Nuclear weapons pose a threat just as global and far more immediate than climate change. They are the ultimate enforcer of equality, destroying with absolutely no regard to race, gender, or nationality. As such, they are everyone's problem. If we can't get rid of them, we must find a better way to live with them, one that relies on more than luck and fragile human nature. There are two major accomplishments for which the 20th century will no doubt be remembered thousands of years from now if human memory perseveres. One is venturing beyond the bounds of the Earth to the Moon. The other is the discovery and development of nuclear power. One may prove the path to our future, the other may be the harbinger of our extinction. The idea of humanity standing at a crossroads is one of the first clichés of the atomic age, and yet it's still apt. As awesome and powerful as these weapons may be, they are not some supernatural force beyond our control. We conceived them, we decided to create them, and we decided to continue building them. If, in the final analysis, nuclear weapons are merely tools that we have invented and invested with certain qualities, then we can also choose how or whether to use them, and how to think about them. We don't need to accept the inevitability of doomsday, but to make those choices it's necessary to acknowledge and consider all their implications. We can control nuclear weapons, or nuclear weapons will control us. The choice is ours.